type. Now, obviously, when you've heard this article, you'll realize that you've heard or seen 5 or 10 other stories of this type. We picked this one out just because a couple of details dovetail interestingly with some other things that we're talking about. But I'm sure any one of the listeners with any experience of this, and certainly we ourselves, could name 5 or 10 other similar occurrences and similar sets of circumstances. Anyway, this first article is from the San Francisco Chronicle for Saturday, March 17th, 1984. It's headlined, Incident Near White House, Gunman's Bizarre Claims. Dateline, Washington. The man who was shot Thursday outside the White House fence when he threatened a guard was ordered yesterday to undergo psychiatric testing after he disrupted a hearing with claims that President Reagan, the FBI, CIA, and Air Force Intelligence Agency had drugged him. During his 35-minute appearance before a U.S. magistrate, David A. Mahansky, age 25, disrupted his arraignment 3 times. Quote, the President of the United States and certain elements of the society fill me with drugs and ruin my life, like the communists would, said Mahansky, who was dressed in a blue hospital jumpsuit, his right arm in a sling. Mahansky was shot in the arm Thursday night when he threatened a guard trying to question him. Mahansky said at the hearing yesterday that the government intelligence agencies, quote, have put a bug in my head which transmits everything I think across the country. I don't need another nut ward. The president has had me in 3 already, unquote. Magistrate Arthur L. Burnett ordered Mahansky sent for testing to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the federal mental institution in southeast Washington, and ordered another hearing within 30 days. John Hinckley, Jr., who shot Reagan 3 years ago and was found not guilty in the case by reason of insanity, also is held at St. Elizabeth's. Okay, now, as mentioned, we've had several other articles of this type. We've read several others on our other shows here. As we will see, one of the things that's interesting about this is how some of the details of this supposedly mentally disturbed young man's story dovetail with some other things that we've seen quite a bit of, and we're going to start to find out about some of those things right now.
Okay, now, the following article, research credit for it, goes to Mr. Ted Rubenstein, who's been working with us for some time on this station. Okay. Following story is from the Miami Herald of Monday, May 28, 1984. Now, keep in mind Mr. Mahansky and his strange account there, and see if this doesn't sound similar, and if it doesn't provide a little more insight on just how somebody might be able to transmit thoughts to or from somebody else. Again, from Miami Herald, Monday, May 28, 1984. This is by a man named Al Messerschmidt, a Miami Herald staff writer. It's headlined, Drug pilot says he's caught in a CIA plot. Subtitled, Implants Called Part of Plan to Control World. James Pettit, P-E-T-T-I-T, convicted drug pilot, admitted arms smuggler, has told the same story over and over again. Nobody believes him. Embedded in his neck, he says, are tiny electronic devices put there by the CIA to control his thoughts. A federal judge heard the tale and ordered a psychiatric examination. The psychiatrist said Pettit is legally competent. The judge ordered a CAT scan, a sophisticated X-ray of Pettit's neck. The test found nothing. When a Dade Circuit judge heard the story, he thought Pettit was trying to talk his way out of an arson charge. The judge ordered new X-rays when Pettit offered to accept a 30-year jail sentence if they turned up nothing. To the surprise of the judge, the prosecutor, and even Pettit's attorney, the newest tests from Jackson Memorial Hospital show 2 foreign objects, unquote, in Pettit's neck. Circuit Judge Howard Gross has ordered exploratory surgery to find out what they are. Thoughts that don't belong to me keep appearing, Pettit said during an interview in the Dade County Jail. The only problem I'm having is getting the implants exposed. Up until the newest X-rays, there was nothing to give credence to his story, unquote, said Pettit's latest attorney, Roy Gelber. I feel that now there is some objective proof of what he is saying. It is the kind of tale that could become a bestseller, a spy thriller with drug smugglers' airplanes crashing in flames, organized crime, murders, and mind control by the CIA. Sitting in a tiny interview room in the jail, Pettit holds up 1, then 2 X-rays. Each is about the size of a sheet of typing paper. See the circled areas, he says? See that thing that looks like a little bottle? That, my friend, is an implant. They're not metal, they're quartz. They're like tiny radio receivers. I think they were going to use me in a program to assassinate someone, Pettit says. I can't prove the CIA put them in there, but there is no way any other government agency has the power to do that. You think about it. I can't be the only one implanted, unquote. Physically, James Pettit, 39, is a wreck. Burnham Pettit was what federal drug agents called him because of the many planes he crashed during his brief career as a drug pilot. Pettit's latest crash in April of 1982, a Lockheed Lodestar carrying Quaaludes, was the worst. When the plane exploded in a Colombian pasture, Pettit was burned over 54% of his body. 8 days later, he was admitted to the burn center of the U.S. Army Institute of Surgical Research at the Brooke Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas. Hospital spokesman Ray Deary, D-E-R-Y, confirmed that Pettit was treated by 2 doctors at the center until July 2nd, 1982. Pettit said that while he was at the burn center, the implants were put in his neck, face, arms, and ears. The CIA program was called Operation Crystal Ball, Pettit says, and he found top-secret documents on it in a Key West dumpster in the mid-1960s. They came from a safety deposit box that was broken into at the former Key West National Bank, he says. The documents described a CIA plan to take over the world's judicial and political systems through mind control by the year 2000, Pettit says. The crystal ball routine I'll never be able to prove, he says. But his discovery of the documents is one reason the CIA focused on him, Pettit says. The other reason was his search to find out why his older brother, Herschel Neil Pettit, died in the Gulf of Mexico in 1978. Pettit says his brother was a straight arrow, unquote, and he couldn't believe reports that the elder Pettit had committed suicide aboard a boat loaded with pot. I think he was working for the CIA or the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, Pettit says. I went to New Orleans. I talked to an organized crime family. I gave them a list of names. CIA, CIA, CIA. Don't fool with it, they told me. I put it all together in my head. Smuggling, CIA connected. James Pettit is obsessed by thoughts that the CIA can control him. In a deposition, Pettit asked his ex-attorney in federal court, Kathy Hamilton, if she was working for the agency. No, she said, but the CIA once offered her a job as she was graduating from college. Pettit says Hamilton's fidgeting with her hair and with cigarettes were triggering mechanisms, unquote, to control his mind. In motions filed in court, Pettit says his former attorney, Assistant Public Defender James Webb, once showed up in court wearing a Duke University ring. The year on the ring wasn't the year of Webb's graduation, a tip-off that Webb was working for the CIA, says Pettit. I accused him of it. Webb says there's no truth to the accusation. The federal jury that convicted him of drug smuggling in 1983 was controlled by the CIA, says Pettit. Defense attorney Hamilton is convinced that Pettit is linked to the agency. I'll tell you this, she says, Jim Pettit has worked for the CIA. That has been confirmed. Pettit has told me he worked for the CIA. In addition, Charles Marty has told me he worked for the CIA, that he has had Pettit checked out, that it was confirmed. Marty, a co-defendant in the federal drug case, was to have been a co-pilot on a drug flight with Pettit. In the middle of that trial, Marty's defense attorney, Alexander Martoni, asked for a hearing out of the presence of the jurors because he had learned that Marty had met secretly with the DEA and the CIA. The CIA tried to get the charges dismissed because of the CIA connection with my client, Martoni told U.S. District Judge Jose Gonzalez. There are letters in their files. I have direct confirmation that Jim Pettit has flown for the CIA, said Martoni. Jim Pettit needs some definite help. The government owes him that. He's been impaired as a result of those flights. The U.S. government has never taken responsibility for what happened to Jim Pettit. Before Pettit's federal trial, defense attorney Hamilton asked Gonzalez to order a psychiatric test and a CAT scan of Pettit's head. Dr. Charles Mutter, M-U-T-T-E-R, or Mutter, reported that Pettit was competent to stand trial and added, quote, It is my opinion that this individual is attempting to contrive a story to evade further legal proceedings. Although his alleged belief would represent a psychotic delusion, there is nothing else in the mental status exam that is consistent with mental illness, unquote. The CAT scan at Jackson Memorial found nothing. Pettit didn't testify. He refused to cooperate with Hamilton. The attorney said nothing about the CIA or implants. The jury convicted Pettit. Gonzalez ordered a 15-year prison term. A 15-year prison sentence, one of the stiffest in the Operation Screamer cases. Pettit's extensive criminal record, he has served several prison terms, prompted the judge to order the tough sentence, Hamilton says. Now Pettit awaits trial in circuit court, accused of setting fire to his girlfriend's house after barricading himself inside when DEA agent Beasley tried to arrest him. The case was scheduled for trial before Judge Gross last week. The day the trial was to begin, hospital officials, responding to a court order, brought copies of the federally ordered x-rays to court. Pettit, defense attorney Gelber, and prosecutor Phil Maniatti, M-A-N-I-A-T-T-Y, huddled in the jury room with Dr. Robert M. Quenser of Jackson's radiology department to examine the x-rays. The x-rays showed the top of Pettit's head, but didn't show the neck area behind his ear. Pettit, who was representing himself with Gelber as co-counsel, offered to plead no contest to the arson charge. That arson charge, by the way, interrupting here, was that he was basically charged with having set fire to his girlfriend's house. Pettit, who was representing himself with Gelber as co-counsel, offered to plead no contest to the arson charge and accept a 30-year sentence if another set of x-rays showed nothing. Judge Gross sent Pettit back to the hospital. When Dr. Quenser returned with the newest tests, he told the judge that something unexplainable is in Pettit's neck. I thought he was just fabricating a story to beat the charges, said Gross. The x-rays give me something to think about. Until the radiologist came in, I thought it was nonsense, said Maniatti. I don't know what those two things are. The radiologist said it could be metal from an accident, but it's certainly worth checking into. But it has nothing to do with this case. Tuesday, Gross ordered the hospital staff to perform an operation to determine what is in Pettit's neck. Well, there's several things that we should take note of in connection with that story. First of all, the fact that Pettit's attorney Hamilton has definitely established that he worked for the CIA is worth taking note of, and as well that his partner, a fellow by the name of Marty, Charles Marty, also worked for the CIA. Now, we've talked at great length on this station, on this and other broadcasts, about the involvement of the CIA and other federal agencies with narcotics trafficking. And Pettit apparently, at least according to his own account, was involved with that traffic, as was his brother. Worth noting that Pettit claims to have found documents about something called Operation Crystal Ball, which he says was a CIA program to control the entire world's political and judicial systems by the year 2000. Now, we have never seen anything about Operation Crystal Ball. We are going to talk about some other CIA mind control programs in this program. Take note also of the fact that the x-rays did establish that there were implants or something in Pettit's neck. And also remember the fact that Pettit suspected that these implants were basically stuck in there in order to get him to commit an assassination, because the use of mind control in order to get people to commit assassinations is something that we're going to talk about at great length on this broadcast. And the article I just read you is not the end of the Pettit story.
Okay, actually, as was mentioned at the end of that last article, James Pettit was taken in for surgery. There was a period of some time elapsed between the initial Pettit story and the surgery coming up, and of course, when we read the original story, a lot of the listeners here on KFJC were rather interested to find out what would happen, since these things so seldom are actually brought to any kind of confrontation. Anyway, here's the follow-up story. All right, this is also from the Miami Herald for June 9th, 1984. Credit for this also to Ted Rubenstein. Headline is X-rays surgery fail to find bug in man. Now, listen to the story, though, and it sounds a little bit different than the headline would suggest. It's by Bill Looning, who's a Herald staff writer. The first CIA operation in Jackson Memorial Hospital history ended in disappointment Friday for James Pettit. It was just after 10 a.m. when Pettit, age 39, convicted drug pilot, accused arsonist, and firm believer that the Central Intelligence Agency has planted electronic thought control devices in his skull, rolled into Ward D at Jackson in a wheelchair and leg irons. He was clutching a court order for the surgery that would prove his claim, ease his mind, and maybe cut his prison time. Quote, "I'm not going to let them put me to sleep," he said warily. "Jackson's a damn government hospital." He needn't have worried. After reviewing new x-rays taken Friday, the Jackson physicians scheduled to do exploratory surgery and find out just what was in Pettit's head refused to operate above the neck. Quote, "I'm not touching that head," said Jackson professor of surgery Gerardo Gomez. Skipping on down, it explains that they did take some scar tissue out of his back. Quote, I want those things that look like bottles taken out of my head. Any refusal by Jackson Memorial Hospital to follow this court order constitutes, in my opinion, collusion with the CIA, said Pettit, holding the folded order from Circuit Judge Howard Gross as senior surgical resident Michael Kotler sewed up his back. Quote, tell me, doctor, do you work for the CIA? What are you talking about? Gomez said, laughing uneasily, looking confused. I don't work for the government. Okay, skipping on down at the end. Quote, I want it known that the doctors at Jackson Memorial Hospital refused to operate on the suspicious area, Pettit said. Quote, Mr. Pettit wants the court order enforced, Gelber said. He said they would try again in court. Since I took this case, I've had 7 people come to the office asking if I can help them with similar problems, Gelber said. One said she was John Kennedy's girlfriend and the FBI had put transmitters in her head so she wouldn't get JFK in trouble. Everybody wants to know what those things are in his, meaning Pettit's, head. Okay, so essentially what the story boils down to, and there's a lot of stuff in the middle talking about the scar tissue that they took out of his back. Essentially these people, the head surgeon has refused to take the stuff out of the back of his neck. They refused to actually even operate above the neck when in fact there was a court order to that effect. And that was the only reason he was in the hospital. He was not in the hospital to have scar tissue removed from his back. He was in the hospital for exploratory surgery. Anyway, so the upshot is, it says X-rays, surgery failed to find bug in man as the headline. Well, in fact, the X-rays are what prompted them to be sent into surgery, the fact that there were things shown up on the X-rays. And the surgery was not performed in the area where the things were seen. So this is the way that, if not consciously, that somehow that news is manipulated, because you certainly couldn't tell from the headline what the article was about.
Now, these two articles, the stories of Mr. Mahansky and Mr. Pettit, are really, as we're going to demonstrate on this and the next broadcast about mind control, merely the tip of the iceberg. Now, the Operation Crystal Ball that was alluded to by Mr. Pettit is not something that we can comment on authoritatively here, because obviously we've never seen the documentation, and as Pettit himself says, he could never prove the Operation Crystal Ball routine. But it is a matter of public record that the CIA, as well as the military, have been involved for quite some time in ongoing projects in order to effect mind control on individual human beings for a number of different purposes. First of all, the CIA itself has had a number of different projects to attempt, as they would say, attempt unsuccessfully to control the human mind. As we're going to prove tonight, those attempts were only 2 successful. One of them was called Operation Bluebird, and by the way, these all ran into one another. Operation Bluebird, Project Artichoke, and Projects MK Ultra and MK Delta. Now, these projects involved a number of different things, not only experimenting on human beings with various psychoactive drugs, but also the attempt to find, in a sense, the perfect courier. In other words, to use mind control on a military or intelligence courier in such a way as that even if captured and tortured by an enemy, he would not be able to divulge the information he was carrying, because that information was locked away in his mind and could only be brought out by someone who had a series of cues which would unlock the post-hypnotic suggestion to forget the message which he was given under hypnosis. Another major focus of these programs was to get someone to attempt to assassinate someone, not only against their will, but without their subsequent knowledge. And this is going to be a major focus of the broadcast tonight. Now, before we get into a well-documented, albeit very primitive, mind control technique, I think it's worth noting that the techniques we're going to be talking about tonight are quite old. The technique we're going to talk about first, something called RHIC-EDOM, which is something we're going to detail in just a second, has basically been in existence. It was fully operational by the mid-1960s. It's worth noting, too, that someone we're going to talk about in the second broadcast, one of these CIA mind control couriers, a woman named Candy Jones, in a letter to a former British intelligence operative named William Stevenson, well known by his intelligence nickname of Intrepid, was informed by Stevenson that he had used such couriers, such zombie couriers as Candy Jones was, in British intelligence in the Second World War. Okay, so these techniques go, in an operational sense, go back that far, because the CIA has claimed that it stopped experimenting on these techniques some time ago. And also in the second broadcast, we're going to read part of an interview with a U.S. government assassin who's going to testify that yes, the experimenting has stopped because it's operational. But the point to really understand here is that these techniques, the techniques that we're going to describe in detail this evening, are old. They've been fully operational probably for a half a century now, at least some of them. We're going to begin, as I said, by taking a look at a technique called RHIC-EDOM, and a description of this technique. And keep in mind now the situation of Mr. Pettit with his implants in his neck that he said were transmitting thoughts to him which were not his own. To describe RHIC-EDOM, we're going to talk about a book called Were We Controlled? Were We Controlled was written by a man who wrote under the pen name of Lincoln Lawrence. Lincoln Lawrence is identified on the back flap as a major network newscaster who's done a lot of writing, has also worked with the Defense Department on a number of different things. And he began investigating mind control in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, Were We Controlled by Lincoln Lawrence was published by University Books in New Hyde Park, New York, and copyrighted 1967. And Mr. Lawrence, in Were We Controlled, defines RHIC-EDOM as follows. He writes, "Behavior control has progressed far beyond your most fearful dreams and certainly beyond the printed information available to you. There are two particularly dreadful procedures which have been developed. Those working and playing with them secretly call them RHIC and EDOM. RHIC stands for radio-hypnotic intracerebral control, EDOM for electronic dissolution of memory." Now, in order to sort of get a little bit of background on how these techniques came to be developed, we're going to talk about a man named Jose Delgado. And Jose Delgado was the pioneer in something called ESB, or electrical stimulation of the brain. And his significance and background we're going to talk about right now.
Okay. Coming up first, and again, this is from Were We Controlled? The article is from the New York Times of Monday, May 17th that he's leading off with, and once again by Lincoln Lawrence. In the New York Times of Monday, May 17th, 1965, writes Lawrence, there appeared a front-page story with two photographs headlined, quote, "Matador with a radio stops wired bull." This story graphically detailed the fascinating experiments conducted by Dr. Jose M.R. Delgado in his laboratories at Yale University's School of Medicine and certain field work in Cordova, Spain. These experiments were explained by Times writer John A. Osmondson in these words, quote, "Afternoon sunlight poured over the high wooden barriers into the ring as the brave bull bore down on the unarmed matador," in quotes, a scientist who had never faced a fighting bull. But the charging animal's horn never reached the man behind the heavy red cape. Moments before that could happen, Dr. Jose M.R. Delgado, the scientist, pressed a button on a small radio transmitter in his hand, and the bull braked to a halt. Then he pressed another button on the transmitter, and the bull obediently turned to the right and trotted away. The bull was obeying commands from his brain that were being called forth by electrical stimulation, by the radio signals of certain regions in which fine wire electrodes had been painlessly implanted the day before. The experiment, conducted last year, which at the time the article is written last year would have been 1964, in Cordova, Spain, was probably the most spectacular demonstration ever performed of the deliberate modification of animal behavior through external control of the brain. Quote, "He has been able to play monkeys and cats, quote, like little electronic toys that yawn, hide, fight, and go to sleep on command." The story continued. Experiments have been conducted on human beings by Dr. Delgado and other scientists, primarily during the treatment of certain types of epilepsy. He has been working in this field for more than 15 years. Techniques that he and other scientists have recently developed have been refined to the point where, he believes, a turning point has been reached in the study of the mind.
Continuing now with Were We Controlled by Lincoln Lawrence. A vital question that would link ESB research at Yale with advanced RHIC was put to Delgado bluntly. Had the control of the brain been attempted on either humans or animals using radio waves alone, with no implantation in the skull? A guarded look came into the scientist's eyes. There had been experiments, unquote. That was as much as he would say. On May 6, 1965, in the course of the James Arthur Lecture on the Evolution of the Human Brain at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, Dr. Delgado left his audience with this thought. Science has developed a new electrical methodology for the study and control of cerebral function in animals and humans, unquote. In his paper published in Exerta Medica International Congress No. 87, Tokyo, 1965, Professor Delgado, in reference to chronic radio stimulation of the brain, has this to say in his conclusions. Radio stimulations of the brain were applied for 5 seconds once a minute, more than 20,000 times during 14 days, with reliable results and without disturbances of thresholds, spontaneous electrical activity, or morphology of neurons. These facts suggest that programmed stimulation of the brain may be carried out perhaps indefinitely. Note that phrase, that programmed stimulations of the brain may be carried out perhaps indefinitely. Returning to where we controlled. Remember those words, programmed stimulations and perhaps indefinitely. As our journey through the structure of the rumor, by the way, is the rumor that mind control was used in the assassination of President Kennedy, as our journey through the structure of the rumor moves into strange byways, they will reassure you we are not dealing here with science fiction. All of this takes us a trifle past treating epileptic symptoms directly on the road that leads to RHIC. The taunting, mocking question that constantly arises when evaluating Dr. Delgado's public announcement of his work is, how recent are these developments? Has he brought us up to date? Wide-eyed, he will tell you he can't imagine, unquote, how ESB could be used as a tool in brainwashing during wartime. But perusal of his work divulges the fact that his efforts have been quietly subsidized by grants from the Office of Naval Research. 2 points here. First of all, the question of how recent are Dr. Delgado's experiments. We're going to deal with that in just a second. And also the phrase, the sentence I just read you. But perusal of his work divulges the fact that his efforts have been quietly subsidized by grants from the Office of Naval Research. So that is basically a branch of naval intelligence, and they have been involved with Dr. Delgado. Now, as we're going to see, this is not the only military or intelligence group that was subsidizing Dr. Delgado's ESB work.
All right. The next section we're going to read is from a book called Mind Control by Peter Schrag, S-C-H-R-A-G. This is copyrighted 1978 by Pantheon Books of New York. Before I read that, though, I want to go back to one little segment here from the very first article we read about David Mahansky, the young man who was shot outside the White House in March of this year, claimed that he had been drugged and essentially mind controlled. This was his claim. And I just want to read this one section here. After he disrupted a hearing with claims that President Reagan, the FBI, CIA, and Air Force Intelligence Agency had drugged him. I just wanted to bring that up because, again, purely circumstantial stuff, but it's rather interesting that somebody who is, your basic garden variety of nutcase, you would expect to come up with things like Reagan, the FBI, and the CIA. It is interesting to hear somebody drag Air Force Intelligence out of a hat to accuse of mind control. Anyway, we're going to read a brief segment here out of the book Mind Control by Peter Schrag, and just bear that in mind. Although the practitioners, in this case Mr. Schrag is referring to the practitioners of this kind of experimentation on humans, although the practitioners complain about government controls and interference, they are themselves agents and beneficiaries of the state, both in terms of funds and other forms of support. It was the state, through NIMH and LEAA. NIMH is the National Institute of Mental Health. LEAA is the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which helped to fund Mark Irvin and Sweet's Neuro Research Foundation of Boston. It was the state, through the Public Health Service, the Office of Naval Research, and the U.S. Air Force Aeromedical Research Laboratory, which funded Delgado's work in the 50s and 60s. So, again, it's rather interesting. Not only is the Office of Naval Research, but indeed the Air Force Aeromedical Center turns up as being the people funding that self-same Dr. Delgado, who was the one out stopping the bull with the radio transmitter.
And as Niptuck pointed out very appropriately, if, as the authorities claim, Mr. Mahansky is merely an ambient psychotic, why would a crazy person focus on the Air Force Intelligence Service as a vehicle for mind control if, as they claim, he was merely rambling incoherently and with no basis in fact? Going back to Mr. Delgado here, again, keep in mind his links with the U.S. Air Force Office of Aeromedical Research and the Office of Naval Research. I'd like to read you a short section from a publication, an alternative news publication that was published in the early 70s called The Realist. It was put out by a fellow by the name of Paul Krasner, and Krasner subsidized and printed the research of May Brussel, whose work we feature on this station. And in the issue of The Realist that came out in the summer of 1974, basically titled, Why Was Patricia Hearst Kidnapped? And it deals with the Symbionese Liberation Army. There's an interesting piece of information here about Dr. Delgado. This is from the Congressional Record. Quote, and Dr. Delgado's speaking here. This is a quote of him, and he has some interesting views. Quote, "We need a program of psychosurgery for political control of our society. The purpose is physical control of the mind. Everyone who deviates from the given norm can be surgically mutilated. The individual may think that the most important reality is his own existence, but this is only his personal point of view. This lacks historical perspective. Man does not have the right to develop his own mind. This kind of liberal orientation has great appeal. We must electrically control the brain. Someday armies and generals will be controlled by electric stimulation of the brain." Dr. Jose Delgado, that's from the Congressional Record, number 26, volume 118, February 24th, 1974. Keep in mind the phrase, man does not have the right to develop his own mind. And because Mr. Delgado has some interesting views. I would also note, by the way, that May Brussel, who wrote this article, was the first person in the country to hint that, or actually to state that mind control was possible. And this early work of hers has been borne out rather dramatically by research, much of which we're going to present you this evening. Keep in mind that phrase again of Delgado's, man does not have the right to develop his own mind, and we must electrically control the brain. That sounds less equivocal than his statements quoted by Lincoln Lawrence.
Yeah, it's especially interesting in light of the fact that this is a man receiving government aid, your tax dollars at work, to practice experimenting on mind control. And this is a man who feels it's evidence of a liberal orientation to think that people's brains should not be electronically controlled for the good of the state. Yeah, okay. All right, back to the book Were We Controlled by Lincoln Lawrence, and a little more information on Dr. Delgado and the Yale project. Bear in mind that the earlier article from the New York Times published in Were We Controlled suggested that the experiment with a bull had taken place in 1964, according to that article, or a year before the time that article was written. Anyway, back to Were We Controlled. Perhaps, the author writes, there is a considerable gap of time between what Dr. Delgado and Yale announced today and what progress they have actually made. An amusing sidelight pointing toward this possibility came when a gentle bit of investigative scrutiny was applied to the good doctor's statements. In May of 1965, John Osmundson's excellent New York Times article refers to Delgado's flamboyant demonstration with the bull as having taken place, quote, last year, 1964, in Cordova, Spain. Although Dr. Delgado modestly avoids emphasizing the Spain episode in conversations at Yale, he nevertheless has a series of large photographic blow-ups of himself and the bull on the wall behind him. If you gaze at the pictures of the experiments on the wall and Dr. Delgado at the desk in 1965, you must notice that in Spain, Dr. Delgado was an athletic and striking, black-haired figure of a man who might even have stopped the bull bravely with a sword instead of a radio transmitter. Across the desk from you, supposedly a matter of, quote, months later, sits the distinguished gray-haired scientist of the moment. Why this unseeming skepticism, the author asks? Why this cynical probing and doubting as to whether we are being handed ancient history instead of the real news about ESB, so vital to the understanding of RHIC, and of course ESB, electric stimulation of the brain, and RHC we're going to hear about a little bit more in just a moment.
Okay. Now keep in mind the fact that Dr. Delgado either was lying in his teeth when he said that or that basically that the people who reported that Delgado's research had been done in 1964, that is the experiments with the bull, were either lying in their teeth or else Dr. Delgado went completely gray in 1 year. And keep in mind his equivocal statements about, well, he wasn't sure if radio control alone had been used to control animal behavior. Next, Lawrence presents some historical background as to how far back not only electrical stimulation of the brain, but also some of the root technology of RHIC, radio-hypnotic intracerebral control, goes. Returning again to Were We Controlled? Let us compare the doctor's announcements with a paper offered by another equally well-qualified man of science. We refer to the late L.L. Vasiliev, V-A-S-I-L-I-E-V, professor of physiology at the University of Leningrad. We quote from Critical Evaluation of the Hypnogenic Method of the Results Obtained by Its Application, Improved Version of the Hypnogenic Method from Experiments in Mental Suggestion, unquote. It should be noted that we move a little further in the direction of RHIC as hypnotism is introduced into the procedure. Here are excerpts, quote, As a control of the subject's condition when she was outside the laboratory in another set of experiments, a radio setup was used. Not many experiments of this sort were carried out, but the results obtained indicate that the method of using radio signals substantially enhances the experimental possibilities, unquote. The date of this paper and for these experiments was 1934, 31 years before Yale's news, unquote, announcement. In another part of the paper, Professor Vasiliev reports, quote, Tomaszewski, I.F. Tomaszewski, famed Russian physiologist, carried out the first experiments with this subject at a distance of 1 or 2 rooms and under conditions where the participant would not know or suspect that she would be experimented with. In other cases, the sender was not in the same house and someone else observed the subject's behavior. Subsequent experiments at considerable distances were successful. One such experiment was carried out in a park at a distance. Mental suggestion to go to sleep was complied with within a minute. Here, over 30 years ago, was primitive RHIC in operation. It is inconceivable that the fraternity of science has not exchanged information, achieved similar breakthroughs, and progressed far past the announced point in this field. What then is RHIC? It is the ultra-sophisticated application of post-hypnotic suggestion triggered at will by radio transmission. It is a recurring hypnotic state, reinduced automatically at intervals by the same radio control. An individual is placed under hypnosis. This can be done either with his knowledge or without it by use of narco-hypnosis, which can be brought into play under many guises. He is then programmed to perform certain actions and maintain certain attitudes upon radio signal. The signal is practiced while he is under hypnosis to teach him, unquote, how to respond. Certain behavior can therefore be played, unquote, to use Dr. Delgado's term, over a period of days or even months. Reintroduction can be instituted by the same procedure to continue the control for an unlimited time. That, in essence, is RHIC. Take note of a couple of things in this passage. First of all, the fact that a person can be hypnotized without their knowledge. If someone can be administered any one of a class of drugs known as the sedative, or any one of several of any one of a number of drugs that belong to the sedative hypnotic class of drugs, they can be placed in hypnosis without willingly submitting to the procedure. Now, some people can't be hypnotized at all under normal circumstances, but with the introduction of these drugs, and of course it's relatively easy for a military or intelligence agency to drug someone without their knowledge, anybody can be placed in a state in which they can be hypnotized. And it's worth noting here a couple of things about hypnosis, that a subject who is placed under hypnosis can be basically can have their memory of something erased, and what is known as a post-hypnotic block can be instituted. This basically would prevent, I really should say, the hypnotic subject from remembering the procedures which he was conditioned to perform while under hypnosis. And that's very, very important, that someone can be hypnotized to do something, and they can have all memory of that erased by a post-hypnotic block, okay? And we're going to talk about a physiological means for messing up someone's mind and memory in just a second. Now, the means by which radio can be used to reinforce this hypnotic suggestion will be talked about in a second. Basically, we're looking at a cross between a conditioned reflex and a hypnotic suggestion, okay, a post-hypnotic suggestion. So it's really an intersection of several different psychological techniques and involves several different physiological and technological instrumentalities as well.
Okay, now bear in mind, too, as we've mentioned a couple of times, that most of this information, most of this material, and apparently, as far as we can tell, the state of art in most of these things was pretty old hat in 1967, 65, 69, when a lot of these books that we're working from were written. The CIA themselves claimed to have stopped mind control operations in the late 60s, or in the mid-60s. That's as may be. You can decide for yourself whether you trust the CIA's word about that sort of thing. However, so we're talking about, at very best, we're talking about a technology that was already old hat 20 years ago. And you can extrapolate based on your knowledge of other types of medical and electronic technologies. Anyway, back to the book, Were We Controlled? And we're going to find out the companion term to RHIC and get that defined a little better. And Lawrence writes as follows. To our index of terms, add one more, EDOM. EDOM refers to electronic dissolution of memory. If that term causes you to sigh weakly and lean backward toward your shelf of science fiction, we refer you to the Berkeley meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1965. There, EDOM surfaced for just long enough to be noticed. At that meeting, Professor J. Anthony Deutsch of New York University probably didn't realize he provided pioneer public substantiation of an important segment of the EDOM theory, but he did. Before we consider what his speech implied, let us define roughly what EDOM is. The sub rosa work in this field by the same men who developed RHIC is fraught with implication of space-age weaponry. To put it quite simply, EDOM enables man to juggle with other men's sense of time. It provides illusionary distortion of memory that destroys time orientation. For the execution of a crime, and in parentheses the author's written like the one in Dallas, which because that is the theme that threads this book together, or the execution of an organized warfare tactic, EDOM offers unbelievable new powers. How does it work? Well, let's do a bit of homework. The basis of stored memory is the presence of a neutral transmitter substance, acetylcholine, that's spelled acetylcholine, at a synapse, which separates one nerve cell from another. EDOM, through the use of radio waves and ultrasonic signal tones, suddenly builds up an excess of the transmitter substance so that it cannot transfer excitation from one cell to another. It, in effect, blocks memory of the moment, which is our feeling of momentary time. It stops time for as long as it is placed in use. EDOM could therefore be used for, let us say, a period of several minutes to make someone skip over those minutes without being aware of the passage of time. Nice toy. We will see how it may have been brought into play a little later on. Professor Deutsch, in addressing the Berkeley meeting of the AAAS, described his work in this field, apparently with no awareness of its connection to EDOM. In a report entitled Anti-Cholinesterase and Dissolution of Memory, he notes, quote, too much transmitter, like too many cars on a highway, causes a jam and so stops transmission. An excess of acetylcholine stops transmission across the synapse, unquote. In his report, Dr. Deutsch describes the loss of memory due to the administration of a drug which raises acetylcholine levels. But according to the rumor, which again is the thread of the JFK assassination that he's following, according to the rumor, the developers of EDOM have managed to go a step further and stimulate the production of acetylcholine not by drugs, but by radio waves.
Okay, now, keep in mind the fact that basically the acetylcholinesterase and acetylcholine are substances that occur naturally in the brain, but by using radio waves to stimulate them, they can be used to block neural impulses, neural transmission, rather, between one nerve cell and another. Keep in mind the metaphor suggested by, I believe it's Mr. Deutsch, who said basically that it's like having too many cars on a freeway, that the stimulation of the acetylcholinesterase can block the transmission of a nerve. Of a nerve impulse, rather, across a synapse, okay? Going back to Were We Controlled, Lawrence presents information here that there was, and keep in mind this book was published in 1967, Lawrence presents information here that there was already by that time a generator transmitter which could, using radio waves, cause the excessive production of the neural transmitter and the subsequent blocking of the transmission of a nerve impulse across the synapse between nerve cells. Okay, again, synapse is a gap between nerve cells. There is already in use a small EDOM generator transmitter which can be concealed on the body of the person. Contact with this person, a casual handshake or even just a touch, transmits a tiny electronic charge plus an ultrasonic signal tone which for a short while will disturb the time orientation of the persons affected. Not so precise or predictable a tool as RHIC, it can nevertheless be a potent weapon for hopelessly confusing evidence in the investigation of a crime, as we shall see. Continuing. A little later, Lawrence writes, "We have seen that radio transmission can definitely produce meaningful stimulation of the brain. For RHIC, the response need not be even as complex as those we have read about. All that is necessary is a simple neuromuscular twitch activated by radio. One of the few glimpses we have been given by the scientific community of the ultra-miniaturized radio muscle stimulators was announced quietly by Dr. Wen-Sing Ko, last name Hsiungko, of the Case Institute of Technology in Cleveland. He admitted that receivers the size of shirt buttons were in the experimental stage, unquote. Receivers that could be buried in muscles and used to stimulate them internally. Dr. Ko's admission to the technical press comes years after the RHIC technicians had placed such implants in operation for less worthy motives than his. Dr. Ko's experiments are related to the work that has been done in Europe for many years to stimulate artificial limbs. His announcement of the extent to which the equipment has been miniaturized is no surprise to the researcher of information on RHIC implantations. Now, accepting the feasibility of this, the radio part of RHIC, let us move on to the hypno aspect. If the subject is placed under hypnosis and mentally programmed to maintain a determination eventually to perform one specific act, perhaps, for example, to shoot someone, it is suggested thereafter each time a particular muscle twitches in a certain manner, which is then demonstrated by using the transmitter, he will increase this determination even more strongly. As the hypnotic spell is renewed again and again, he makes it his life's purpose to carry out this act until it is finally achieved. Thus are the two complementary aspects of RHIC joined to reinforce each other and perpetuate the control until such time as the controlled behavior is called for. This is done by a second session with the hypnotist giving final instructions. These might be reinforced with radio stimulation in more frequent cycles. They could even carry over the moments after the act to reassure calm behavior during the escape period, as in the case of Oswald, or to assure that one conspirator would not indicate he was aware of the co-conspirator's role, or that he was even acquainted with him. This might serve to block so much as a mention of the other's name. So keep in mind that basically what they do is under hypnosis, they induce someone to perform an act, and then they place a small device in a muscle which, when in response to a radio stimulation, causes that muscle to twitch. And every time that muscle twitches, that reinforces the person's will to perform the given action up until the time the person performs the action, okay? Keep in mind also that this was written in 1967, and I guess there's no place better than right here in the Santa Clara Valley, dubbed the Silicon Valley, the sort of center of the electronics industry. Would people be better aware of the tremendous work that's been done in terms of miniaturization in the time since?
Okay, and just want to mention to you that you're listening to KFJC 89.7, Los Altos Hills. We're probably going to take a break in just a couple of minutes. We're going to read, I think, one more short article, and then we are going to take a brief break. Anyway, continuing on from where we controlled, RHIC is a very simple, albeit fiendish combination of two known scientific tools joined in a sophisticated modification to produce a theoretically predictable result. RHIC is one procedure that can explain the events in Dallas. The questions in rebuttal to this stand come quickly to mind. Quote, can anyone, using RHIC or not, be hypnotized to commit a criminal act so brutal as murder? Isn't it true that one will not perform any act under hypnosis that one wouldn't in a perfectly uncontrolled state? The answer is simply no, Lawrence writes. Dr. Theodore Barber of Harvard University in the Journal of Psychology states that a good subject will commit antisocial or dangerous acts if first convinced by the hypnotist that his behavior is normal and proper. Such acts as one account of Dr. Barber's work puts it, as throwing acid at the experimenter. Quote, 2 recent extensive reviews of this problem have not failed to note that since the good subject accepts the hypnotist's words as a true statement, an unscrupulous hypnotist can induce the subject to commit antisocial acts, unquote. Again, the skeptic's retort may be all very well to theorize, but has it ever been proven that a person under hypnosis will actually do these things? The answer is an unqualified yes. Under the hypnotic spell of Bjorn Scho Nielsen, 28-year-old Polly Hardrup walked alone into a bank in a suburb of Copenhagen in March of 1951. In the course of a hold-up that Scho Nielsen had, quote, controlled him to carry out, he calmly shot 2 bank employees to death. When he was caught, Hardrup confessed that he had done the killings under hypnosis. Tried in 1954, Hardrup was found guilty of manslaughter because he was hypnotized, quote, in a state of mental abnormality, unquote, and was committed to a prison mental institution. Nielsen was also convicted of manslaughter, quote, through having planned and by various means, including hypnosis, instigated Hardrup of the crimes, unquote. He was given a life term. The fact that hypnosis was the tool of control was established by Dr. Paul J. Reiter, one of Denmark's leading psychiatrists and an expert in hypnosis. Okay, well, in the next section of the broadcast, we're going to examine this concept even more closely because this is a sticking point for a lot of people. A lot of people refuse to believe that somebody can be hypnotized into performing an antisocial act, even presuming that they could be hypnotized in the first place and activated to perform some act from a distance. We are going to be examining that at greater length, and we're going to be getting into some nitty-gritty stuff and some very complicated but very fascinating case histories of a couple of people. So don't go away. That'll be coming up in about 4 or 5 minutes when we return, and then after we finish that segment, we may be going fairly soon after that to the telephone. So stay tuned. This is Nip Tuck. Dave Emery and I will be back with the next section of Radio Free America following this short... Okay. Anyway, starting the second half then, and you remember we just had left off there with a discussion of, among other things, the possibility of the radio-induced hypnosis being used to force people to commit antisocial acts. And in fact, the question of whether one could credibly say that people could commit antisocial acts under the influence of hypnosis if they were not inclined to commit these kind of acts in regular life.
Now, reviewing very briefly what we've been looking at so far, after a couple of very interesting articles in which people suggested that they had been placed under mind control and had surgical implants which were controlling their thoughts, we took a look first of all at a fellow by the name of Jose Delgado, who had patterned a technique to control behavior of animals and perhaps humans through the use of electrical implants in the brain. And we took a look at the fact that his work was subsidized by the Office of Naval Research and the U.S. Office of Aeromedical Research. We also took a look at the fact that it appears that his research was done well before the time which he or journalists reported that it was done, and also at the fact that Mr. Delgado is of a rather authoritarian frame of mind in that he does not feel that people have the right to control their own minds, okay? That in other words, man does not have the right to develop his own mind. Then we took a look at the development of a technique which has been in operation for quite some time called RHIC-EDOM, radio-hypnotic intracerebral control, electronic dissolution of memory. Now, RHIC basically entails hypnotizing someone to perform a given action, then implanting a small electrical device in a muscle which would cause the muscle to twitch. When that muscle twitches, the person is conditioned to reinforce their will to perform the act which they have been hypnotized to perform. EDOM involves basically using radio waves to stimulate the production of acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter which basically permits a nerve impulse to travel across the synapse, the gap between two nerve cells. If anybody would like to ask us a question about exactly how that works, we can read you some of the text from Were We Controlled. It's extremely technical, so I thought we thought really that it might be best to let go because it'll sound kind of like some gobbledygook on the air. But if you would like us to go into, we'll do the best we can. It's extremely technical, and for that reason and the fact that it probably would not be terribly comprehensible over the radio, we elected to sort of let that slide. But there is a very detailed and, as I said, technical discussion in Were We Controlled as to exactly how that was done. So the technology, RHIC-EDOM, basically permits someone to hypnotize somebody to perform an action and to then reinforce the will to perform that action by remote control. EDOM enables them, again, by remote control, to basically erase someone's time sense by blocking neurotransmitters in the brain. Again, too much acetylcholine apparently functions just like the too many cars on a freeway. It blocks traffic. Now, one question that has consistently come up and is the fact that can someone, is the question of whether or not someone can be hypnotized to perform an action which they would not normally do. Many critics who have suggested that mind control is impossible have cited the allegation that someone cannot be hypnotized into doing something they would not ordinarily do as a means of rebutting the notion that mind control is possible. Well, we're going to read you a section now from a book called Operation Mind Control. Operation Mind Control was published in softcover by Dell Books, and it's authored by Walter Bowart, B-O-W-A-R-T. As I said, published by Dell Books, copyrighted 1978. And what Bowart points out here is the fact that although someone might not be able to be hypnotized into doing something, say shooting someone that they like, say someone would not even under hypnosis could not be convinced to shoot someone that they normally held in high regard, they most definitely could be convinced under hypnosis that this person is in fact somebody else who they would shoot, and then the person will go ahead and shoot them. And that's important to remember. You may not be able to be hypnotized into shooting your mother, but you could be convinced that your mother was in fact someone else who you would be quite willing to shoot, and who you would then go ahead and shoot. Again, reading from Operation Mind Control, Walter Bowart, copyrighted 1978. In 1947, J.G. Watkins induced criminal behavior in deeply hypnotized subjects during an Army experiment. Watkins suggested a distorted view of reality to his subjects by inducing hallucinations which allowed them to avoid direct conflict with their own moral concepts. He carefully chose his suggestions to be in line with his subjects' pre-existing motivational structures, and so was able to induce so-called antisocial behavior. Watkins took a normal, healthy Army private, a young man whose tests indicated a most stable personality, and put him in a deep trance. Though merely striking a superior officer is a court-martial offense in the Army, Watkins wanted to see if he could get his subject to strangle a high-ranking officer. After the subject was deep into trance, Watkins told him that the officer sitting across from him was a Japanese soldier who was trying to kill him. Interrupted, keep in mind this is 1947, right after World War II. He must kill or be killed, Watkins suggested, and immediately the private leapt ferociously at the officer and grabbed him by the throat. In his waking state, the private would have been aghast at the thought of trying to strangle a superior officer. But under hypnosis, believing the officer was a dangerous Japanese soldier, the young private had to be pulled off his superior by 3 husky assistants. The officer came within a hair's breadth of being strangled, as the young man was most persistent in his attempt to kill what he regarded as the enemy. Watkins repeated this experiment with other subjects. The second time, he used 2 officers who were good friends. One of them was given the hypnotic suggestion that the other was a Japanese soldier and that he must kill or be killed. The man who had received the command not only made a powerful lunge at his friend, but as he did, he whipped out and opened a concealed jackknife, which neither the doctor, his assistants, nor his friend knew he had. Only the quick action of one of his assistants, who was a judo expert, prevented a potentially fatal stabbing. In both cases, reality was so distorted that the subjects took murderous and antisocial action. If they had accomplished their defensive acts, unquote, both men could have been convicted of murder, since the law did not recognize motivation through hypnosis as a fact. The courts, in all but a few cases, had adopted the traditional scientific view that criminal behavior cannot be induced under hypnosis. That view still stands today. To test the premise, which was then widely held, that a normal person under hypnotic trance could not be made to divulge information which would be self-incriminating, Watkins conducted a number of experiments where a monetary bribe was offered to withhold information. Watkins discovered that, quote, when placed in a trance, they spilled every time, either verbally or in writing. The subject of one of these experiments was an enlisted whack in military intelligence. Her commanding officer ordered her not to reveal a list of what were made to appear to be real military secrets. Under hypnosis, she spilled everything. So basically, summing up here, this fellow J.G. Watkins, first of all, hypnotized a soldier into believing that his superior officer was a Japanese soldier whom he then proceeded to try to strangle. He then hypnotized him to think that one of his friends, an actual friend of his, was a Japanese soldier. A fellow then pulled out a knife, or I guess a different fellow then pulled out a knife and attempted to kill his friend. And apparently people who were conditioned to not disclose information could be induced under hypnosis to spill all of that information. So again, keep in mind that it is possible to get someone to think that reality is other than what it really is and act on the basis of a false concept, and that is how someone can be hypnotized into doing something that they would not do when in a normal state of consciousness.
All right, continuing from Bullard's book on a new chapter and on a rather interesting series of revelations of fairly recent vintage. This is just starting at the beginning of Bullard's book, chapter 11, A School for Assassins. The author writes as follows. The cryptocracy, and by the cryptocracy, Bullard is referring to the people at the top of various intelligence groups interested in this sort of secretive behavior in terms of experimental mind control. So he's using it as a generic term. It doesn't have any specific significance to any specific people. The cryptocracy recruited their assassins from among people who had already demonstrated a violent nature, people who had few reservations about taking human life. No homicidal maniacs were recruited because they could not be controlled. The cryptocracy needed killers who would not murder on impulse, but only upon command. Once selected, the assassin candidates were turned over to the military, where, under the guise of, quote, combat readiness training, they underwent a complete program of conditioning. Graduates of the program would forever after act with ruthless efficiency. They would eliminate local political leaders in a foreign country or undertake search and destroy missions in violation of national and international laws. They would be given the cover that would allow them to enter the foreign service, or they would pose as embassy marine guards. In July 1975, the Sunday Times in London quoted a U.S. Navy psychologist who admitted that U.S. naval intelligence, and I just interrupting for a moment, you'll remember that U.S. Naval Intelligence was one of the groups earlier that was funding Delgado's research, as well as other mind control research. The U.S. Navy psychologist who admitted that U.S. Naval Intelligence had taken convicted murderers from military prisons, conditioned them as political assassins, and then placed them in American embassies around the world. This admission came shortly after the Senate Intelligence Committee had scolded the CIA for plotting a number of political assassinations around the world. From the congressional reports, however, one got the feeling that the cryptocracy was being chastised not for the assassinations it had successfully accomplished, but for those which it had attempted but failed. The attempts on the life of Fidel Castro drew the greatest notice from the congressional committees and the press. According to the Sunday Times story, naval psychologist Lieutenant Commander Thomas Narut, N-A-R-U-T, was assigned to the U.S. Regional Medical Center at Naples, Italy. When he first made public the Navy's part in programming assassins, he was attending a NATO conference in Oslo on dimensions of stress and anxiety. In attendance at that conference were 120 psychologists of all descriptions and from many countries. Many of them were involved in research on how to improve man's ability to cope with stress, but none of them felt compelled, as Narut did, to discuss their work so fully or so frankly. The stated objective of the conference was to exchange information on how soldiers and people in difficult jobs could cope with stress. Dr. Narut's talk was on, quote, the use of a symbolic model and verbal intervention in inducing and reducing stress. His speech began with a plug for the Navy. He knew, he said, that many of the scientists present had often encountered problems in their purely scientific research because of the military's inclination to research that would yield quick and useful results. He sympathized with those who had trouble getting subjects, funds, or both out of the military for their purely scientific research. But things were different in the Navy, he said. In the Navy, Nerut bragged, there were plenty of captive personnel who could be used as guinea pigs. In the Navy, there was a computerized record of each man's background and psychological profile, so that a quick selection of men with suitable psychological inclinations for experiments could be made. Navy psychologists not only had access to computerized records, but also to psychological tests and background data on a large number of people. In the Navy, Nerut said, funds were plentiful and there were no problems with transporting subjects for study to nearly any place in the world. Nerut stated proudly that the U.S. Navy provided scientists with the most advanced research facilities in the world. A Canadian psychologist at the conference later remarked, Nerut's message was loud and clear, join the Navy and study the world. In his brief discourse, Dr. Nerut did no more than hint at the work he had been doing in teaching, quote, combat readiness units to cope with the stress of killing. Later, however, during private questioning with a small group of listeners, reporter Peter Watson of the Sunday Times, a former psychologist among them, Nerut in full unfolded the amazing story of the Navy's programming of assassins on an assembly line basis. In his mid-30s, Dr. Nerut had just completed his doctoral dissertation on the question of whether certain films provoke anxiety, and whether forcing a man to do irrelevant tasks while watching violent films would help him cope with the anxiety they produced. When pressed by Watson to explain the details of this kind of conditioning, Nerut said that he had worked with, quote, combat readiness units, which included men being programmed for commando-type operations and for undercover placement at U.S. embassies. These, Nerut said, were, quote, hitmen and assassins, Nerut's own words, made ready to kill in selected countries should the need arise. Dr. Alfred Zittani, an American delegate to the conference, was very surprised by Nerut's disclosure. Quote, do you think Dr. Nerut realizes what he has just said? Zittani asked. That kind of information must be classified.
The conditioning of Nerut's assassins was accomplished by audio-visual desensitization, a standard behavior modification process. These men were desensitized, unquote, to mayhem by being shown films of people being killed or injured in a number of different ways. At first, the films would show only mild forms of bloodshed. As the men became acclimated to the scenes of carnage, they would see progressively more violent scenes. The assassin candidates, Nerut explained, would eventually be able to dissociate any feelings they might have from even the goriest scenes they viewed. Nerut said that, of course, U.S. naval psychologists would have first selected the candidates for training by their psychological makeup. Those selected for assassination assignments were often from submarine crews and paratroops. Others were convicted murderers from military prisons who had already shown a proclivity for violence. Still others were men who had been given awards for valor. World War II Medal of Honor winner Audie Murphy was a subject of extensive research. The best killers, according to Nerut, were men whom psychologists would classify as passive-aggressive, unquote, personalities. These were people with strong drives that were usually kept under tight control. Such types were usually calm, but from time to time would exhibit outbursts of temper during which they could literally kill without remorse. Nerut said that through psychological testing, he and his colleagues were looking for more such men for further conditioning. Among the tests used by the Navy to determine violent natures was the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which is used widely by educators and businessmen to determine psychological qualities of students and employees. The tests consist of hundreds of questions designed to measure such personality traits as hostility, depression, and psychopathy. According to Nerut, the men selected by the tests or by evidence of past violence were taken for programming to the Navy's Neuropsychiatric Laboratory in San Diego, California, or to the Naples Medical Center, which employed Dr. Nerut. Audio-visual desensitization was the major technique used in programming the assassins. Psychological indoctrination completed the programming by instilling the desired prejudicial attitudes. The audiovisual desensitization began with the subject strapped into a chair with his head clamped so that he could not look away from the screen. A special mechanism prevented the subject's eyelids from closing. The candidate was then shown a film of an African youth being crudely circumcised by fellow members of his tribe. The youth was circumcised with a blunt knife, painfully and without anesthetic. This well-known film is used widely in psychological experiments to create stress. Afterwards, the candidate was asked about details of what he had seen. He was asked, for example, to describe the color of the belt on the doctor's trousers or the motif on the handle of the knife that cut off the foreskin. The next film showed a man in a sawmill where planks were sliced from huge logs. In the operation of the saw, the man slipped and cut off his fingers. As the films progressed in gruesomeness, the reactions of the candidate were measured by sensing devices. Heartbeat, breathing rate, and brain waves were recorded, very much as on a polygraph. That, of course, is a lie detector interrupting here. If the physiological responses, which might have been great in the beginning, slowed down and resumed normal patterns as the more bloodthirsty scenes were viewed, the candidates were judged to have completed this stage of conditioning.
Continuing on with Boert's Operation Mind Control, the last phase of conditioning, Narrett said, was to indoctrinate the candidates to think of their potential enemies as inferior forms of life. By this stage, the candidates would have already been selected for assignment to particular countries. They would be shown films and given lectures which portrayed the customs and cultural habits of the foreign countries in a biased fashion. The people of those countries would be portrayed as enemies of the United States and were always spoken of in demeaning terms. They were often presented as if they were, quote, less than human. Their customs were ridiculed, and local leaders were presented as evil demagogues, even if they were legitimate political figures. According to Dr. Narut, it took only a few weeks to indoctrinate susceptible candidates by this process. Those who were not susceptible to the conditioning were dropped earlier in the program and returned to other assignments. Narut admitted that he did not have the necessary, quote, need to know as to where all the programmed men were sent, although at one point in his conversation with Peter Watson, Narut specified that programmed assassins have been installed in the Athens embassy. He said that his busiest time was when a large group of men went through such training towards the end of 1973, at the time of the Yom Kippur War. After the Oslo conference interview, Watson returned to London to file his story. Watson is the reporter for the Times and a former psychologist himself. Watson returned to London to file his story. Writing up the details, he found a few points which needed clarification, but he could not reach Narut either at his home or in his laboratory in Naples. Watson then asked the U.S. Embassy in London to comment on the information Narut had volunteered. The embassy passed the buck to the U.S. Navy. Within a few days, the Pentagon issued a categorical denial that the U.S. Navy had ever, quote, engaged in psychological training or other types of training of personnel as assassins. Quote, they also denied that any such training had ever taken place either in San Diego or in Naples. They said they, too, had been unable to contact Lieutenant Commander Narut, but they did confirm that he was on the staff of the U.S. Regional Medical Center in Naples as a psychologist. But Dr. Zittani later offered to testify about what Narut had told him to, quote, appropriate authorities. Watson was also approached later by a psychologist in Los Angeles who said he had seen the Pentagon denials, so thought Watson would like to know that he had lent the San Diego psychologist a copy of his film on circumcision, which was used in the desensitization conditioning. A few days later, Narut was located. He flew to London to discuss the matter, ostensibly with Watson's paper, the Sunday Times, but instead he held a press conference, saying only that he had been talking in, quote, theoretical and not practical terms. He then flew back to the Naples base. After his return to Naples, U.S. Naval headquarters in London offered the official explanation for Narut's statement. Narut had, quote, personal problems. A few days later, Watson was able to contact Narut at the U.S. hospital in Naples, but he refused to elaborate on his disclosure. During the Oslo conference interview, Narut had said several times that what he was saying about the assassins was, quote, coming out anyway. He was referring to the congressional disclosures about CIA assassination plots. but the fact that the Navy had been operating along lines similar to the CIA was not known to the public, nor has it subsequently been admitted. The details of the story that Lieutenant Commander Nerut related have been strongly and categorically denied in all subsequent queries of the Navy. So, looking back, there's a variety of interesting things in the Nerut story. Some of this we're not going to have time to cash in on tonight in terms of bringing up supporting documentation that goes with it. But the ascending series of desensitizations. Now you notice in this there isn't even any mention of use of drugs or anything else. So this is either possibly a different type of training, or it's possible that those details were omitted, or that that's a later stage of conditioning, or something like that. It's possible, as they mentioned, that this Dr. Nerut did not have need-to-know authority to see the whole operation all the way through. Anyway, it touches on some other interesting things that we've seen in other places that we may have time to talk about later on.
Again, the processes involved here are very, very common processes, which anybody who's ever studied psychology in any university in the United States would be familiar with. First of all, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory is something which probably a lot of you have taken. It's a very commonly used test, and it's administered in institutions of all kinds, okay? The desensitization process, audiovisual desensitization, is also, as indicated, a very, very common technique. There's been a lot of research in classical psychology tests about eliminating phobias using that precise technique. Well, in this case, in a sense, a phobia, namely the phobia of extreme physical violence, is what is being removed. Note also that the people are already inclined in that direction, the people selected as candidates for this thing. I think it's also worth noting that despite what I think one could regard as the pro forma denials of the Navy, the source for this information is the London Times. It's one of the most respected newspapers in the world. It's also quite conservative. Many people think, for example, the New York Times, which has a liberal reputation, the London Times is a pretty conservative and very respectable newspaper, so this is not National Enquirer affair. And Nerut's story, by the way, has been printed in a lot of other publications. Now, keep in mind that Delgado's work, for example, was funded by the Office of Naval Research. It's again, not only was the CIA involved in developing mind control techniques, and specifically mind control techniques to perform assassination, but the military as well. And keep all of that in front of you. You know, remember all of that as we go through this, and again, go back and put some of these details together. But as with RHIC, in which the commonly used technique of post-hypnotic blocking, the technique of conditioning, in this case, a Pavlovian conditioning was used. Operant conditioning can also be used in certain methods of having people commit assassination. The difference between those can be discussed during the phone-in session if you'd like. But again, the techniques that are involved here are very, very common and would certainly be familiar to anyone with even a relatively elementary knowledge of academic psychology. Now, keep in mind Lincoln Lawrence's account, basically, of mind control being used in the assassination of President Kennedy. We're going to go back to a CIA assassin. Now, we're going to read you an entire chapter from Boert's book, and this is almost certainly the most detailed and complete account of the functioning of a mind control assassin ever presented. And because of that, we're going to read you the entire chapter unedited, so that basically you'll have all of the information at your disposal and can go back and check it out. And I think, again, the time during which mind control has been in effect is worth taking note of here. The techniques which we were talking about with RHIC-EDOM were fully operational by the mid-1960s. Mind control zombie couriers were testified, their existence circa World War II was testified by William Stevenson, a very high-ranking British intelligence agent, in fact, in charge of all British intelligence in the Americas during World War II. So keep in mind, now the fellow we're going to be talking about here, a fellow named Luis Angel Castillo, was basically the events we're about to describe here, or rather that Boert relates in Operation Mind Control, occurred in 1967, okay, almost 20 years ago. And note the degree of sophistication here in the conditioning. Now, Boert titles this chapter The Four Faces of a Zombie, and it begins. On March 2nd, 1967, 24-year-old Luis Angel Castillo was arrested by the Philippine National Bureau of Investigation, the NBI, on suspicion of conspiring to assassinate President Ferdinand Marcos in Manila. In a series of interrogation sessions, the NBI and Philippine Army investigators gave him truth serum at his request and put him under hypnosis. During one of these sessions, Castillo revealed that he had been involved in an assassination 4 years earlier. Castillo told the NBI, both under hypnosis and truth serum, and also in a normal state, that he had been hypno-programmed to kill a man riding in an open car. Although Castillo did not know the identity of his target, the scene of his supposed hit was in Dallas, Texas. The date was November 22nd, 1963. After revealing this information, Castillo asked for political asylum in Manila. He was quoted in the Manila Times as saying, quote, "I am afraid to go anywhere anyway. I am as good as dead now," unquote. "I don't know how I got into Dallas and how I got out," Castillo told reporters, "but I am sure I did not carry a gun." The Manila Times story reported that Castillo had arrived in Manila carrying a Philippine passport which identified him as Antonio Reyes Eloriaga, Eloriaga, a returning resident who had been expelled from America for overstaying his visa and stealing a car. Castillo, by the way, is Castillo. While in the U.S., Castillo had traveled under the aliases Angelo Rodriguez, Razo Hernandez, Mario Rodriguez, Ignacio Gonzalez, Gradieda, and Antonio Eloriaga. Castillo told investigators that a woman with a German accent, a Mrs. Krebs, had given him his initial instructions in Dallas. According to Castillo, she was just one of many individuals who worked on him to place him in a deep hypnotic trance for the Kennedy job. Castillo said that he had been a private in the Cuban militia, the Segunda Organización Defensiva in Santiago, Cuba, when he was initially chosen for training in espionage work. He was subsequently trained for the Defensiva under a Colonel Calma, C-A-L-M-A, at a camp located about 15 miles from the Bay of Pigs. Among the members of the training cadre, Castillo said, were a communications expert named Karnovsky, along with some other Cubans and a handful of Americans. One American he identified was James Smith, who attended to Castillo's needs both as a civilian in Cuba and later in the United States. 3 years later, on October 2nd, 1966, Castillo was arrested in New Mexico and charged with driving without a proper auto registration. His arrest was made under the Eloriaga identity. Castillo was brought before New Mexico Justice of the Peace Elmer Bassett and sentenced to 4 days in jail. "The reason I gave him a jail sentence," Bassett said, "was I figured when a fellow has a hard time remembering what his name is, there's something wrong with him," unquote. After serving his sentence, Castillo was turned over to U.S. immigration authorities because he had no proof of U.S. citizenship. Bassett reported that, quote, "Castillo said he was from Madison, Wisconsin, but was born in the Philippines. He couldn't show that he was from the Philippines or that he wasn't," unquote. Bassett also revealed that someone had called him a few hours after Castillo had appeared before him and asked that the man be released, unquote. "I don't know who it was," Bassett said. "I just told him I couldn't do that," unquote. And Nip Tuck will continue with the Castillo story.
According to the NBI, which again is the Philippine Bureau of Investigation, the Filipino FBI, Castillo had Antonio Eloriaga's Philippine passport on his person when he was arrested in Manila. Based on information provided by the Intelligence Service of the Philippine Armed Forces, the NBI had been searching for him since February. They had evidence that Castillo, in the guise of Eloriaga, had made contact with a guerrilla group that was constantly plotting to assassinate Marcos and overthrow the Philippine government. The NBI set to work grilling their captured suspect. They knew something of his criminal past. They knew, for example, that he had been arrested in 1962 for carrying a concealed weapon. They also knew that 2 years later he had been sentenced to a state reformatory in Bordentown, New Jersey for larceny. But nothing prepared them for the shocking story implicating him in the events of Dallas. They asked Castillo to submit to a lie detector test and were surprised when he said that he preferred truth serum. Suspicious of both his strange story and his behavior, NBI officials called in a psychiatrist to examine him. But even after the psychiatrist judged Castillo normal, the NBI investigators still refused to take Castillo's bizarre and contradictory story at face value. Later, reporters connected with the Manila Times were equally dumbfounded by Castillo's strange behavior. One reporter described him as, quote, a now talkative, now reticent cloak and dagger man. He clammed up when he was asked whether he was in the Philippines to help implement an assassination plot against President Marcos. In his truth serum statement, he claimed he had worked with a, quote, cell of reds, unquote, to end someone's life. But during his interview with the press, he said, quote, neither do I admit or deny it. When quizzed about Lee Harvey Oswald, he drew a blank. As a member of the Warren Commission, Gerald Ford was queried by the Philippine authorities about Castillo's revelations concerning the JFK assassination. Ford said that he would not comment on the Castillo story until he had more information. A spokesman for the Dallas Police Department said that they had no record on Castillo. Nevertheless, the U.S. Embassy did agree to a closed-door meeting between embassy officials and NBI Director Serafin Fausto on the subject of Castillo. After the meeting, Fausto refused to comment further on the story, but he did tell reporters that, quote, although publication of the story has prejudiced investigation of the case, one good thing has come out of it. Needed information is coming in from the United States to shed light on the case. Fausto also made it clear that leads obtained from the U.S. Embassy justified continuing the investigation of Castillo's link to the assassination of President Kennedy. After making an official request for assistance from the FBI, the NBI clamped a news blackout on the story, and nothing further was published in the press. Private investigations later revealed that Castillo was spirited out of the Philippines, but not before a series of hypnotic sessions had taken place at the request of the FBI. The FBI wanted to have Castillo, while under hypnosis, place the time of the Kennedy assassination. They wanted to know when Castillo had come to Dallas, what time he arrived at the building, and from what location he was supposed to shoot. They wanted to know the time he left the building, the names of any people involved, and any information by which might indicate how the plot was hatched and by whom. It came as a surprise to the NBI that the FBI also wanted Castillo questioned about the Boyeros Airport, 8 miles south of Havana, Cuba. The FBI requested that the tightest possible security be kept on any testimony obtained from the hypnotic sessions. In the last of 3 sessions requested by the FBI, Castillo was induced into deep hypnotic trance by the ordinary talking method in an NBI interrogation room in Manila. While in that trance state, he was questioned for more than 3½ hours. Now, Dave will continue.
The hypnotist report stated, quote, initially, the subject indicated an admixture of desired susceptibility to hypnosynthesis, but deep-seated resistance due to the presence of a post-hypnotic block. This block appeared to have been connected with the presence, nightmarish, of a Mrs. Krebs. The total removal of this block may pave the way for maximum results, unquote. The hypnotist reported that during the pre-trance warm-up, he examined Castillo and found little scars on his forehead, chest, stomach, and fingers. Castillo told him that the scars were the result of a car accident in the U.S., which happened when some men were chasing him while he was trying to deliver, quote, an envelope of some kind, unquote. Castillo mentioned that after the crash, he'd awakened in bandages in a hospital bed. Names which were presented to Castillo in the pre-trance interview were repeated while he was under hypnosis. He recognized the names of several individuals who were then gaining notoriety in connection with New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison's JFK assassination investigation, but Castillo revealed that he knew some of the people by other names. Throughout his recollections, Castillo suffered stomach cramps, said he felt a weight on his legs, unquote, and cried out in pain a number of times. Through the manipulations of the hypnotist, he was able to recall that on many different occasions he had been taken to a factory. Mrs. Krebs and Castillo had always driven to the factory in her car, and they had always entered through the front door. Castillo could not remember the exact location of the factory, other than that it was located, quote, way outside Chicago, unquote. He spoke of a romantic relationship with Mrs. Krebs, But while one moment he spoke of her as nice and kind, unquote, in the next breath he said he hated her. According to the hypnotist's report, one thing was certain. Whoever Mrs. Krebs was, she, quote, controlled the subject's activities and consciousness like a nightmare, unquote. Eliciting information from Castillo was no easy task. Over the course of many interrogations, the hypnotist discovered that Castillo could be taken to 4 different hypnotic levels. It appeared to the hypnotist that each level came closer to the truth. He labeled these states Zombie 1, Zombie 2, Zombie 3, and Zombie 4. Depending upon which zombie state Castillo was in, his mannerisms and identity changed. In the first state, Zombie 1, Castillo believed he was a Loriaga, and he told tales of anti-American espionage. During Zombie 2, he took on the identity of a tough-talking CIA agent in trouble. While in Zombie 3, again Castillo emerged as an agent whose cover had been blown. At this level, however, he experienced a compulsion to kill himself. On the day he was to have assassinated Marcos, Castillo responded to a program he had revealed in an earlier interrogation. He attempted suicide in his jail cell by swallowing a bottle of epoxy glue. The Zombie 4 state revealed that Castillo's true name was Manuel Angel Ramirez, a 29-year-old native of the Bronx, New York. In this state, he had no recollection of his youth except for a hazy memory of his father, who Ramirez believed was a highly placed official at the agency, unquote. As Ramirez, Castillo said that most of his life had been spent in training with or on missions for the Special Operations Group of the CIA. He remembered one training camp where he learned clandestine and martial arts. Throughout the interrogations, the theme of programmed agent, unquote, emerged. Castillo's testimony under hypnosis was that of an individual whose identity had been completely erased and reconstructed several times over. On May 30th, 1967, Castillo spontaneously went from his normal state into a zombie state. In answering Castillo's question about transfer from the hospital to jail, the hypnotist unknowingly said, quote, "That depends entirely on the big chief, you know," unquote. Upon hearing these words, a blank look came over Castillo's eyes, and all efforts to wake him were at first unsuccessful. The hypnotist then called out a series of phrases from Castillo's notebooks and found that the phrases, "I will win if I don't lose my nerve," and, quote, "I must believe myself or no one else will believe me," unquote, awakened him. And Iptak will continue.
The next day was Castillo's birthday. The NBI planned to give him a birthday party as an excuse to get him drunk to see if his behavior changed. Castillo, it seemed, had a huge capacity for liquor. Drunk to the eyeballs, he saluted one of the NBI agents and called him Colonel. "Where do we fly tonight, Colonel?" he asked. The agent quickly told him that he was to fly the same mission as the last one. Castillo said, "Haiphong," then drunkenly fell into bed. By the way, Haiphong, of course, is the Haiphong harbor area in North Vietnam. Castillo said Haiphong, then drunkenly fell into bed. He dug his fingers into his throat and vomited. He cried out for a doctor, and between vomit spasms rattled out his mission to the hypnotist. He said his real name was Manuel Angel Ramirez, his rank was sergeant, and he was assigned to the Strategic Air Tactical Command in South Vietnam. He said his immediate superior was Colonel Summers. He was in Saigon in January 1966, he related, and had flown B-26 missions over Haiphong and Hanoi. He came to Manila, he said, to kill President Marcos in June, when the president would make a public speech. If his assassination attempt failed, someone else would get Marcos before the end of 1968, Castillo added. "I am dying," he groaned, and pleaded again for a doctor. He thought he was dying from a heart attack. "If I die today," he warned, "my secrets die with me." When the NBI doctor arrived, he examined Castillo and pronounced him fit, except for his obviously drunken state. He tried to give him a shot to calm him down, but Castillo protested violently. The doctor then asked him to take a pill, which he did without resistance. 2 days later, Castillo was given another medical examination by Dr. Alexis Guerrero of the NBI. A series of tests were given to measure his breathing rate, pulse rate, sweat production, and other functions. All of these tests were performed in zombie states 1, 2, and 3. The doctor noted that in each state there was a vast difference in pulse rate, and assumed, because of what Castillo said, and the reactions of his heart and respiration, that he was experiencing some emotional agitation. Sodium amytal was administered while he was in the zombie 3 state. According to the hypnotist, Castillo did not even notice he'd been given the injection. Soon he began to talk as he'd done previously while in the drunken state. "I'm Sergeant Manuel Ramirez of the Tactical Air Command," he said. When asked to reveal his base, he said, "You'll never know," adding, "I'm a pilot. I've flown a B-26. "The NBI are suckers," he said a little while later. "They thought they arrested me, but there I was, waiting for them to get me. I know of a great plot. I am supposed to expose it after I'm arrested. I know I will eventually return to my country." And in parentheses, the author has put the U.S. "I'll go through the motions of a trial, conviction, and jail as a criminal. After a couple of months, I will be released for my next assignment." Awakened from the zombie state, Castillo was told all about these various states and his strange behavior while in them. The hypnotist explained how he thought Castillo had been programmed. Castillo seemed baffled by this news. He said that he was not told by anybody about being programmed. He said that, quote, "Papa didn't even know about the zombie state." He grew agitated, saying that if he were in the zombie state, he might even kill Papa, and then, quote, "the agency would go to blazes. Hell will break loose on the guy responsible for the zombie," unquote. Asked in a trance to identify Papa, Castillo said that he was not just a guy, but was his real father. He described him as having a mustache and smoking a pipe. He said he was the only one who could send the agency to, quote, blazes if he, Castillo, was killed on this mission. He said that Papa's initials were AD, and that his first name was Alan. He said that he would personally tell Papa about the zombie when he got back. Well, before Dave continues, we should just state in that whether what Castillo said was true or whether it was something that he was led to believe or not, the Papa that seems to be being identified here is fairly obviously meant to be, if it is not actually Alan Dulles, who was, of course, the head of the CIA at that time. Of course, the initials AD, the first name Alan, and the pipe, the mustache, the whole thing, obviously is Alan Dulles. Whether that really was him or whether this was something that Castillo was conditioned to say, well, we can discuss these different possibilities later on.
Okay, before continuing, you listen to KFJC Los Altos Hills. Okay, continuing now with the narrative of Castillo Ramirez, or whatever his name was, this very interesting hypno-programmed assassin. After more than 40 hypnotic sessions lasting from 1 to 5 hours each, covering the period from April 3rd to June 25th, 1967, the hypnotist reviewed the data and summarized it for the Chief of the Defense Intelligence Division of the National Bureau of Investigation. The summary report not only involved Castillo in the assassination of John Kennedy, it disclosed that Castillo was a hypno-programmed zombie who would kill on cue. The summary report stated, quote, "The zombie phenomenon referred to here is a somnambulistic behavior displayed by the subject in a conditioned response to a series of words, phrases, and statements apparently unknown to the subject during his normal waking state. While under the influence of such a zombie state, the subject closed his eyes, rose bodily, walked, triggered a pistol, stared blankly, and fell to the floor with no apparent sense of physical pain. As far as could be determined experimentally, the zombie behavior had for its objective the assassination of President Ferdinand Marcos of the Republic of the Philippines," unquote. The report also stated, quote, "Neither the presence nor the discovery of the zombie states in our subject should be regarded as noble or unique. If anything, the only remarkable character of the zombie state in our subject is its deeply ingrained and systematic presentation, indicating a certain disturbing degree of conditioning." Note that phrase, a disturbing degree of conditioning. In a lengthy summary, the NBI hypnotist and deprogrammer of Castillo recounted the details of exactly how he had uncovered the key that unlocked the programmed assassin's mind. The letters XBGUMIDUTYBX were found scribbled on the white surface of a cigarette package which was in Castillo's possession at the time of his arrest. The paper had been folded carefully and tucked into the back of his watch. Castillo had told investigators that this piece of paper was given him by a man named Luis Mauricio. Castillo said that Mauricio also gave him money. Mauricio was known to the NBI as a member of the Huck guerrillas. Placing Castillo in a trance, the hypnotist called out the series of letters on the cigarette package. Castillo did not react. He then tried calling out the letters, pausing at different places. He found that when he paused between the G and the U, saying XBG, a pause, UMIDUTYBX, Castillo would reply with, "I am myself to kill," unquote. The hypnotist then tried the letters one at a time, and then in different combinations. While many of the combinations produced no response, the following were significant. When the hypnotist said X, unquote, Castillo quickly answered Mauricio, unquote. When the hypnotist said BGU, Castillo slowly said, "I am myself," unquote. When the hypnotist said MI, Castillo answered, "to kill," unquote. In another session, the hypnotist experimented with saying Luis Castillo as a command. The hypnotist reported, quote, "A pathetic sight takes place after this. The subject turns his pistol to his own temple and squeezes the trigger as many times as his name is repeated." Whenever the hypnotist would say, quote, "June 12, 1967, 12 o'clock, June 22, 1967, July 4, 1967, or January 1, 1968, Castillo would invariably aim the pistol and squeeze the trigger. The hypnotist found that after the preparatory command to put him in a trace, if Castillo's eyes were open and he saw a photograph of President Marcos, he would, with no verbal instructions, aim and repeatedly squeeze the trigger of his pistol, following the photo wherever it was taken around the room. If the hypnotist said the word kill while Castillo was following this program, he would drop heavily to the floor and remain motionless. The hypnotist's report also includes Castillo's amazing story about his participation in yet another organized assassination attempt. Under hypnosis, Castillo said that the assassination had happened before noon, unquote. He remembered being with a man called Elec, unquote, whom he described as a tall man weighing about 190 pounds, with a hawk-like nose, black hair, and oriental eyes set in a long face. Elec spoke with a foreign accent which Castillo could not identify. He said that he remembered meeting Elec along with 4 or 5 other men in an airport. They then drove together in a black car to a building. Castillo said that he thought the group included both Americans and foreigners, and he thought one man was Spanish.
Continuing. When the group arrived at the building, Castillo said they climbed to a second-floor room, which he described after some uncertainty as brown. The room contained packing crates, a short brown table, a typewriter, and 2, quote, lift-up glass windows overlooking a street. Elec opened a black suitcase, which Castillo described as a bowling bag with a zipper and lock. It contained a scope and pieces of a rifle, which Elec assembled. He set the scope at 500 yards and gave the rifle to Castillo. Castillo did not seem certain about the make or caliber of the rifle, but finally said that he thought it was Russian. Elec told him to shoot a man in the back seat of an open car in the middle of the caravan. He said that the man would be seated with a lady or another man. A mirror was to be flashed twice from a building across the street, so that Castillo would know when he was to shoot. When he saw the 2 flashes, he was supposed to shoot at the next car coming into view. When he was questioned about the identity of the man riding in the open car, Castillo said that he did not know who the victim was. After Elec had assembled the rifle and had given Castillo his instructions, he went downstairs. Later, Elec rushed into the room. Quote, "They got him already," Elec told him. "Let's get out of here." He then grabbed the rifle away from Castillo, dismantled it and stuffed it and the scope into the black bag. Castillo and Elec rushed downstairs, got into a car with 2 other men, and drove away from the building. They picked up a bald-headed, skinny man after they turned the first corner. 3 or 4 blocks later, the car stopped and picked up another man. Castillo said he was riding in the back seat between Elec and the man who had joined them at the second stop. As the car drove away from the scene of the crime, the unidentified man gave Castillo an injection while he wasn't looking. He went immediately to sleep and woke up in a Chicago hotel room with Mrs. Krebs. He and Mrs. Krebs got into a blue car and drove to Milwaukee, Castillo said. While driving there, they heard the news of the assassination of John F. Kennedy on the car radio. Within a few days after the hypnotist submitted his final report, Castillo was out of the NBI jail and had left the Philippines for parts unknown. It was later uncovered that Castillo was returned to the United States in 1967 and questioned by the FBI, whose spokesman said, quote, "We talked to Castillo and he told us that he'd fabricated his story about the Kennedy assassination, said he'd made it up in Manila." The official record says that Castillo was sentenced to 6 years in the Missouri Penitentiary for robbery in June 1971. On August 1st, 1974, he was released after serving 37 months. Castillo's last known contact was with his mother shortly after his release from prison. Since then, he has disappeared from both his family and those researchers who would like to question him further. If Castillo had indeed made it up in Manila, as the FBI spokesman claimed, then he would have had a phenomenal memory, an incredibly high tolerance to sodium amytal and alcohol, and virtuoso acting ability. Neither the psychological profile nor the life history of Luis Angel Castillo supports the conclusion that he possessed any of these talents. Okay, that's the end of Bauer's chapter on Luis Castillo.
There are a lot of things that we ought to mention here, reviewing a few things. First of all, it's interesting to note that Castillo referred to Papa and Alan and hinted at an identity which certainly sounds curiously like that of Alan Dulles. Of course, Alan Dulles was director of the Central Intelligence Agency until the Bay of Pigs, and of course, Castillo's background seems to intersect with the Cuban situation quite heavily. Of course, Alan Dulles was also on the Warren Commission. It's interesting that Castillo would have introduced this AD figure. Remember that Castillo had scars on his arms, chest, and stomach. Now, that recalls, at least in some ways, Mr. Pettit, who had all kinds of scars, and of course, he was involved in a plane crash, but recall that we don't know what the nature of those scars were. Were they in any way related to surgical implants? Recall the RHIC-EDOM technology. It's worth noting that Castillo seems to have had a penchant for suicide. First of all, the Central Intelligence Agency's assassination programs, their attempts to get someone to commit assassinations against their will, frequently involved having the mind control assassin commit suicide afterwards, so he would not be available to spill the beans, so to speak. Now, recall that Castillo attempted to swallow a tube of epoxy, and also then apparently a number of different combinations of those letters on the cigarette package would get him to kill himself. And it's also worth noting, too, that the frightening degree of conditioning, again, look at how complex this situation is. 4 different zombie identities which not only gave different information, but apparently responded in different physiological terms. Now, this, again, the Castillo incident occurred in 1967, and as I said, the mind control technology was fully operational by then, and apparently, at least according to William Stevenson, it dates back to World War II, and that the almost unbelievable degree of sophistication in the conditioning of Castillo certainly lends credence to the notion that there is that degree of conditioning. So keep all of these things in mind, and as a final little comment here on mind control, we're going to read you a couple of pages again from Operation Mind Control by Walter Boert, and this concerns an interview with a U.S. government assassin. Now, Boert does not name this person. The interview was arranged by a chemist. This person apparently had served in the U.S. military for quite some time, and he had the patriotic assassin, as Boert calls him, had extensive experience with mind control. And Niptuck and I are going to read you a couple of pages here, sort of as a final comment on mind control assassination for this program. What do you know, again, this is Boert talking to the assassin. What do you know about the military or the intelligence agency's use of pain drug hypnosis, I asked. They used several different things. I've actually seen, guys coming back with blanks only in certain places of their memory. Let's say that I know positively, not by hearsay, that it's done. You've seen it, I asked. You'll never get me to admit it, he grinned. Well, how is it done, I asked. They use hypnosis and hypnotic drugs. They also use electronic manipulation of the brain. They use ultrasonics, which will boil your brain. When they use hypnosis, they'll at the same time be using a set of earphones which repeat, "You do not know this or that," over and over. They turn on the sonics at the same time, and the electrical patterns which give you memory are scrambled. Again, that recalls EDOM. You can't hear the ultrasonics and you can't feel it unless they leave it on. Then it boils your gray matter. Unless the assassin had done the same research I had, he could only have known this through first-hand experience. The CIA documents released in 1976 revealed that ultrasonic research was undertaken for a period of more than 20 years. But the document said that the research had stopped, so I asked him about that. Yeah, the research has stopped. They've gone operational. It ain't research anymore. They know how to do it, he said. Do you mean that it is your opinion that it hasn't stopped, or do you mean that you know it hasn't stopped? I mean, I know it hasn't stopped, he said. For example, suppose that a dictator in some South American country is setting up some real problems and we try to kick him out. We call in some of my former group and say, "Look, the bastard has got to have a fatal accident and it's got to look good, like he fell on a bar of soap and broke his neck in the bathtub or something." So we go down there and get the job done. But it could be quite embarrassing if any of the guys were cross-examined about where they'd been and what they'd done. So the guys who were in on the job suddenly have a cold or something, and then they are put in a hospital for maybe just a routine checkup. They come out of the hospital in about 15 days. They're alive, they're well, they're healthy, and they're happy too. Lots of luck if you question them. They don't remember anything. That's one way it's used. The other way is to use it to improve memory, say with couriers. You want a secret message carried outside the chain of command. There's no need to have it carried by a person if it's a legal message, because the military's got 1,000 ways of sending messages which are unbreakably secret. But if it's outside the chain of command, as so many things are these days, if it's an illegal message and our Constitution doesn't permit us to do much that is legal, then you have a hypno-programmed guy carry the message. You improve his memory so that he can carry an entire coded book of what appears to be gibberish, and when he's got it down, you give him amnesia and seal off that message by a post-hypnotic code word, and whammo. You've got a real good secret courier, because he can be tortured to death, but he can't remember unless the proper cue is uttered. Then, if the courier is going to operate against the enemy, who might have the techniques of hypnosis down, you give him several layers of post-hypnotic command. Recall the 4 zombie states of Castillo in connection with assassination, interrupting, of course. In the first layer, he'll confess a false message. In the second layer, he'll confess another different false message. Finally, maybe on the 4th or 5th layer is the real message. Our guy who is supposed to get the message knows that the first 3 cues, say, are fake, and he gives the 4th cue, and out comes the correct message. If the courier was in enemy hands, he could be there for years before anybody will figure out where he was in all those layers. Each identity will probably be that of a real cutout, a person enough like him so that the enemy will think they've got the real guy. And Nip Tuck will continue at this point.
Many of the men in my unit were given assignments after which they were so persuaded that they didn't remember anything. I mean to say, they'd gone in believing that the only thing in life that meant anything to them was completing the assignment, to get it done, and when they got done with it, they couldn't remember anything about it. Could these guys have been that way without hypnosis, I asked? Well, they could have believed that their mission in life was that particular assignment. They usually had no family affiliations, no friends, nothing but their careers, but I don't think they'd have forgotten about those kind of assignments, not without a little help, let us say. What was the conditioning that these guys had? Was it drugs, hypnosis, or something else? I wanted to know. Hypnosis, electrotherapy, programming them by tapes, by voice-over earphones, awake or in trance or asleep, by a number of methods. How widespread was this mind control? I asked. Well, that is something I can't really answer. I know of several different groups upon whom it was used. I know that it was used in some of the hairier areas of Korea and Vietnam, and it was started in World War II, but it has been refined far more since then. How much of it was used, I don't know. I know of several groups that I was affiliated with that had it used on them. Would you say this kind of thing did not exist before World War II? I asked. Oh, it did, but it was not in such a sophisticated form. It's as old as man, but now it's refined to an art. Before it was torture and psychological pressure. That can accomplish a lot. We've been trained to use it in primitive field situations. But now it's done with the idea that the mind can be put under complete control, just like they used to use rubber hoses at the police stations. They don't do that anymore. Well, rubber hoses still work, but they don't work as well as some of the other things which the police now have. Are you saying that the police also use mind control? I asked. At the highest levels, yes. The FBI certainly uses it, and they, of course, give a lot of help to the local police. There are certain areas of the brain which control your inhibitions. When they control those centers, then the subject will go on with his assignment, regardless. I've seen men whose mother could be sitting there having coffee, and if they'd been instructed to kill her, they'd walk right in and shoot her, and it wouldn't even upset their appetites for supper. They were conditioned to do it in such a way that they have no guilt. They wouldn't have guilt because after they were through, they wouldn't even remember it.
Okay, well, again, notice the degree of coincidence between the patriotic assassin and some of the information that we presented in connection not only with the audiovisual desensitization of Mr. Nerut's assassins as well as Mr. Castillo. Note of course, the patriotic assassin, again, he was an actual U.S. government assassin. Note his discussion concerning the couriers and how the extent to which couriers are given several different false identities, most of which are designed to give false information. Now, in connection with Castillo, we don't know how much of what he said was true and how much was false, but it certainly is reminiscent of the Castillo situation. And note also that the patriotic assassin claims that the police and FBI are using mind control. This is something that we don't have a whole lot of information on from other contexts, but it's worth noting here. And also, as we said, the technology that we're using now, that we've been describing, the RHIC-EDOM, is quite primitive. Now, ultrasonics were mentioned by the patriotic assassin as one way of dissolving memory and doing certain things. That, of course, is consistent with the EDOM and the device that the little generator transmitter that we heard that was talked about, although that was electrical. This is ultrasonic. And perhaps most importantly of all, keep in mind the statement by the patriotic assassin that the research has stopped, because they always say with the officials when questioned about mind control, they say, oh yeah, we were doing research on it, but it was unsuccessful and it stopped. Well, obviously it was not unsuccessful, and the research may have stopped, but that's only because it was so successful that it's now operational.
All right, we're going to take a short break, and then we are going to be opening up the telephones.